Hello, everyone. Eleanor Beaton here, and welcome back to another episode of the Woman Owned podcast. In today's episode, we are exploring a very simple question. Are you tolerating a market position that is 2 to 3 levels below the altitude you, your team, your company, and your brand are actually operating at? If this question resonates, don't go anywhere. Last week, I aired an episode called The Great Resort. And in that episode, I described how the market is currently resorting expertise into two piles: the strategic partner pile, and that pile is high value, premium pricing, quality, high altitude branding. And then in the other pile, it's the cheap pile. And the cheap pile is very much seen as an interchangeable service provider. And the pricing gap and the positioning gap between those two piles could be one of the greatest cash gaps in your business right now. And not just in terms of your revenue this quarter, this year, but also, of course, the overall enterprise value of the organization that you are building. In today's episode, we are taking that question further and looking at why it is that so many women operators with 7-figure authority are tolerating a market position that is 2, 3, 4 layers of altitude below where they are currently operating. So I want to clarify what I mean by market position. When I describe market position, what I am referring to is the distinctive space you operate and you occupy inside your industry. Are you considered to be a leading high-end premium provider? Are you considered to be a bargain provider that's highly accessible that people go to when they don't have a ton of cash? Are you in the messy, crowded middle that's often described as a red ocean, but is often where people position their companies and their brands when they aren't being intentional? That's what we mean by market position. And what I have seen in my years of working with women operators is that there are many women operators whose market positioning is off. And what I mean by that is that your natural cruising altitude, the level of sophistication with which you show up in the market, the level of sophistication of the advisory that you offer, of the counsel that you provide, the standards that you set for yourself and your offerings, the standards that you hold your clients accountable to, there is a natural cruising altitude that your brand naturally occupies. And what I observe is that many of you are currently selling and serving below your natural cruising altitude, so that the buyers who were primarily buying from you are actually probably 2, 3, 4 levels below the level of sophistication that you are able to provide. And so, in order to serve them, you have to execute an altitude drop to meet them where they are. And I know that this concept of meeting people where they are is a very popular expression. It's seen as the right thing to do. And I will tell you, that is the heart of so much overfunctioning for women-led businesses. Why? Because there is nothing more exhausting than carrying a sustained altitude drop in order to make money. Okay? It's painful. It's expensive. We might be able to handle it for a short period of time, but to handle it for a long time is exhausting. And I have seen this happen so much, and I'll give you a couple of examples. I can remember working with an operator, or meeting an operator rather, who was very highly trained in her space. She was probably one of the best trained practitioners in her specific area in the country, serving the sort of broad market that she served. And she was when I would talk to her about who her ideal clients were, she would constantly tell me like everybody. And on the one hand, her expertise, she had enough expertise that she was absolutely capable of serving everybody. The problem, though, was that truly only the premium buyers, only the people at the top had the level of sophistication required to absorb the full level of sophistication that she offered. And rather than consciously adopting that market position, she unconsciously, unwittingly morphed her brand and market position into something that was more accessible to everybody. And my father was an economist. My grandfather was an economist. I've got his book behind me here on the shelf called A History of Money. And there's this expression in economics, which is that bad money chases good money out. And that's a bit of a harsh analogy because working with a buyer who has less sophistication, a less sophisticated buyer is not bad money, by the way. But I can tell you, to quote Annie, you can bet your bottom dollar that when you serve both lower altitude buyers and higher altitude buyers, the lower altitude buyers will always drive the higher altitude buyers out. Higher altitude buyers do not want to be in proximity with lower altitude buyers. And there are practical reasons for that. They don't want to waste their time. There are status reasons for that, which is very inherent to human behavior. So she was sort of unwittingly serving lower status buyers, and it was showing up everywhere. So it was impacting the type of content that she was making. It was impacting the events that she was showing up at, the people she was engaged in strategic partnerships with. And so because she was operating below her altitude and trying to impress or serve a segment of the market that was multiple layers below where her natural sophistication level was, it wasn't working. It felt exhausting and something felt off. And the biggest challenge that she had was she felt so trapped, you know, and she really wasn't sure how she was going to make this change. Because I will tell you, changing your market position requires a level of discipline and restraint. Great brands are built on what they don't do as much as they're built on what they actually do. Now, the biggest challenge that happens when your market position is off, and if you're still listening to this episode, I suspect there could be a spidey sense or there could be a massive, massive alarm going off in your head that you are currently positioned lower than your natural cruising altitude, and that this may explain some of the exhaustion that you feel. Because positioning is architecture, right? And so when you have architected your business to make you exhausted, you are a highly capable woman, so you will be successful in that aim, right? So one of the great challenges of having a misaligned market position is that it forces you to adopt an economic position that is not favorable to your profit, to your wealth creation, and to the overall enterprise value of your business. So let me give you a couple of examples. And again, this episode is very specifically speaking to those of you who are high authority, have a natural high authority cruising altitude. Some of my really successful entrepreneur friends are incredibly sophisticated themselves, but have consciously adopted a mass market approach. And they embody that approach with the entirety of their being. They will do what is required as a leader, as a brand, as a spokesperson to be that mass market communicator, to be that accessible mass market person, and they have no problems with it. And I love that for them. And that sounds like shade. It's not shade. I love that for them. But that has never been my personal way. And when I look across the portfolio of companies that have been inside the Safi ecosystem over the course of the last 10 years, when it comes to overall income and wealth creation at that more macro level, the authoritative positioning is generally the way to go, right? So some people can do mass market very well, and those are often the brands we hear about. Why? because they are mass market. But the lion's share of the operators who are generating the real wealth are in that premium authoritative positioning. So when you have that natural cruising altitude, but your market positioning is off, so you've got seven-figure authority and you're in a mid-market position, a couple of things happen. The first is that it negatively impacts your economic position. An economic position looks at sort of how money flows in your business. So first of all, it forces you to basically suppress prices. So it forces you to suppress prices. And if you do want to charge premium prices, you need to be able to create asymmetry. So that means that the upside, the value of the problem that you are solving for your customer is many, many, many times greater than the price that they invest to work with you. And the higher altitude your buyer, you are like, what makes a sophisticated buyer? They generally have larger, more complex problems, and the value of solving those problems is exponentially greater than for a mid-market buyer or a low-market buyer. And so sometimes I have noticed in recent years, a lot of women practitioners or women-led businesses have been incredibly turned off by what they see as certain people in, business who charge astronomical pricing, $100,000, $150,000 in consulting fees. And that is not astronomical if you are working with an eight-figure business or a nine-figure business. It is high if you are working with a six-figure business. And so there is a misalignment, right? And so that creates that economic position. They have a market position mismatch, and they are serving a market that is beneath where they're at. And so their pricing is not in alignment and lacks integrity. Now, that is very occasional. What is much more common is that you are forced, or you, in a state of integrity, suppress prices to match kind of the cash flow and buying capabilities of the people that you're selling to. And because you have high standards, that starts to suppress your margins. You can't actually afford to hire the altitude of people required to serve inside your ecosystem. So it creates a really significant mismatch and problem in your economic positioning, right? And so what does this mean? Rather than being able to consistently command and charge and position for higher prices, you are forced to get onto a volume train. And now you are spending extraordinary amounts of time trying to drive customer acquisition and trying to sell to masses of people who don't actually have the sophistication to absorb what you're able to bring to bear. So it creates a lot of challenges. And there's also a part of this, which is the emotional cost that you bear of this as a leader. The fundamental question that I want to ask you to consider and reflect on as a result of listening to this episode is, are you currently tolerating a market position that is beneath you? When people do this, if your answer to that question is yes, or I think so, your immediate response is probably like, what do I do about this? And how do I change this? And in my experience, most of the people who are doing this kind of invite them to consider that they might be doing it. They either already know it, or the minute they hear a conversation like the one I'm having here on today's podcast, they know that is me. How the hell do I get out of this trap? And it does feel like a trap for a couple of different reasons. One, cash flow is queen. And so you're probably asking myself, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to my cash flow if I reposition up? So there's sort of a fear, and we often look at this as primarily a fear and scarcity mindset challenge. That is absolutely a part of it. But what I have experienced is most of the women operators that we see inside the Safi ecosystem that listen to the Woman-Owned podcast, you've done enough personal inner work that you recognize it's potentially a scarcity mindset. You understand that there's a part of you that feels afraid to change your positioning, and you are able to work through that fear if only you knew what to do. If only you knew, how do I upgrade my positioning so I not only have seven-figure authority, but I have seven-figure premium market position? How do I bring those two things into alignment while being able to keep the lights on, meet my financial obligations, and keep running the business? The answer to that question is often the difference between you fundamentally upgrading your market position this year or not. And so I want to share with you, this is the work that we do inside the Safi ecosystem. And the reason that we do this work is because, remember, our fundamental thesis is that women-owned businesses are under-architected. And a lot of times when people think about architecture, they think about your sales process, they think about your organizational structure. And yes, it can be those things, but your position, your market position and economic position, that is infrastructure. If you are building inside an infrastructure that cannot hold you, you are under-architected. And so you become increasingly competent and skilled inside a container and vessel that is too small and was never meant to hold the potential of the impact your business can have. So when I am working through this, when my team and I are working through this with operators who know that in order to create the kind of business that they want, in order to create the kind of wealth that they want, in order to create the kind of open time and the lifestyle and the joy of having a business that actually supports you versus the other way around and not having to overfunction inside it, there are a couple of things that we look at. Thing number one is that we would really pinpoint, what is your natural cruising altitude? Adopting a market position is yes, there's a part of this that is very intentional and it's by design, but there's another part of this that is about naturalness. When you are in the most natural state, what is the altitude at which you are operating? And we want to identify and pinpoint that. The next thing we want to do is identify the gap between that point that is your natural cruising altitude combined with, and it's by design, right? And often I'll challenge, because I think sometimes people underposition themselves because they may have certain hangups about claiming their true market position. That's a collaboration. You've heard on this show many times before, it's hard to read the label from inside the bottle. So one is really identifying that natural proper cruising altitude. The next step then is to look at where you are currently operating. And this is the brutal reality. This is where you are going to get some blunt feedback about where your current positioning is keeping you. And this really comes from looking at your offerings, your marketing, yes, how you do things, how you're showing up, even how you're showing up as a leader. And so that is sort of identifying the gap between your natural positioning or the position, like where you actually belong and where you're operating today. Once we have those 2 points, point A and point B, it becomes about identifying, okay, based on this, what are the highest impact levers that we can pull that are going to close this gap? What needs to happen to make sure the brand is positioned? It's currently at point A. What are the major shifts, the strategic shifts, the systematic shifts that have to happen to get you to point B? And then we choose a date. Now, by developing a very clear rollout plan, a part of what we're going to do there is phase it out, right? Because, we live in the real world. And so we're not going to spend 5 years refining our market position. We're going to do it in phases. But the first thing is to set a target date. And then that becomes a piece of work that can be executed. And then the final piece, which is so key, one of the reasons, especially if you're listening to this and you've been operating beneath your market position, one of the reasons that you may have been tolerating it so long is because you haven't been accountable to anybody to change it. And this is where this concept of board level oversight, and I talked about this in previous episodes on the podcast. Board level oversight is critical for an established woman owner, an established operator. There is no such thing as being accountable to only yourself, right? I love that David Goggins talks about that all day. I love David Goggins, but I am not David Goggins, neither are you. There is a powerful component of sophisticated business leadership, which is where CEOs and leaders have a layer of accountability above them. And this is what helps them to operate at the level that they're capable of operating at. And so those are kind of the pieces that go into upgrading your market position. So now your authority, your 7-figure authority, is matched with a 7-figure market position. If you would like to explore this work with us, I strongly encourage you to reach out. I'm very available. Like, message me on Instagram or LinkedIn. I'm always curious to hear, if you're a listener to the podcast, introduce yourself. But if this is work that you want to do, certainly reach out and we can talk about next steps. And my main takeaway here is that one of the most exhausting things for a woman, there's almost nothing that will create the level of overfunctioning that a woman leader can do than dropping altitude, dropping her cruising altitude and maintaining a cruising altitude that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 levels beneath her natural altitude. Thank you so much for being here and listening. I will see you next week on the podcast. And until next time, have a great week. Thank you so much for tuning into the episode. If you found value in what I shared, please go ahead and like this video, give it a thumbs up, and leave me a review or leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for being here. We'll see you next week.